I would almost liken us to the space race. We have a decade to get to the moon. Well, while we're not competing with other countries, we're actually all working together.
Sure.
And so, but the challenge is we have deadlines coming up quickly, and we're racing to get there. And so if the industry looks at only funding an option, the challenge with that is what if that option does not get us there?
Welcome to Lightbulb Moments, a video podcast series brought to you by Mitsubishi Power, bringing you the brightest minds, most engaging stories, and illuminating points of view from across the energy transition. My name is Erin Bordelon, and I'm your host. Today, I've got Bobby Noble with me. He's joining us from EPRI. Bobby, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Erin, and it's a great honor to be with you today on this podcast.
Awesome. So before we get into everything, I just want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell me your story. How did you get here? What are the major characters? All of those things.
Sure. So my journey in this energy field kind of started just over 20 years ago as I became a grad student at Georgia Tech and started in the combustion lab focused on gas turbine combustion. Interestingly enough, my first project was around hydrogen and how we can incorporate hydrogen into the fueling process for gas turbines and looking at characteristics. Kind of led to today where now I lead the gas turbine programs at EPRI, and we've been very instrumental in many demonstrations, especially looking at the incorporation of hydrogen into the power plant.
Perfect. And I know that's a really hot topic right now, and I'm sure you've got a lot of interest from customers and probably just other people in the energy sector as well. Before we move forward, EPRI, y'all, is an acronym. It stands for Electric Power Research Institute, and you're based out of?
So we're based out of Palo Alto.
Oh, okay.
Our headquarters are there, but our main office really is in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I'm located. So EPRI has been around since 1972. And with that, we were born out of a blackout. And so the blackouts that occurred in New York City, the EPRI became the response for the industry to ensure that we kept the safe, reliable, and affordable electricity flowing. And so now today, we're more so energy focused, as now fuels are energy carriers, and it's a bigger, broader discussion as we're going to talk about today.
Yes, and it's funny how reliability, flexibility, those things don't change, right?
Exactly.
Those always have to be the common denominator.
Exactly.
No matter what. And I know EPRI, y'all do a large umbrella of research, yes. Which I think is really great right now for where we are at in energy transition.
Right.
Considering the more pragmatic considerations, but then also kind of these larger social implications and the Justice 40 initiative and how to incorporate all of those things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. EPRI, especially with our partnership through the Low Carbon Resources Initiative, and that has been focused on all the different aspects that you just touched on. And so while EPRI's core research is broadly across nuclear and then all other forms of generation, plus all of our transmission and distribution and utilization type work, we are heavily involved in these other aspects and thinking about from an environmental standpoint, from a community aspect, because now it's a broader discussion. It's not just getting those electrons to your customer. There's so many other aspects we have to consider.
So I was reading one of the research papers on your website recently, and that was one of the points touched on kind of repeatedly, right? Like the considerations in energy development today, they're vastly more complicated than they were for a number of reasons, and not just for the fuel consideration. That's part of the conversation. So you mentioned briefly that your part is in demonstrations heavily. So can you speak to that a little bit? What are they? Why are they important to the industry?
Again, a big focus of what we've been looking at the past few years is, how can we show the industry, but also the public in general, that these fuels are a viable option from a low carbon standpoint, because this really is a paradigm shift. We don't have to even touch on the topic, but mentioning it, fuel availability for a lot of these fuels is a big question. So these demonstrations are super important, and the reason why is because we need to show the public, but also the industry as well, that these fuels can be utilized in a safe and reliable manner as we look to transition to a decarbonized future. Really, these demonstrations are to pick out certain aspects that we can point to as a research aspect of saying, yes, the hardware can utilize these fuels, but then also what are the benefits? What are the implications for the gas turbine? What sorts of topics do we need to think about? What needs to be dug into deeper? What are other potential benefits from utilizing low carbon fuels? And so there was a lot of great work that occurred between Mitsubishi, EPRI, and also Georgia Power and Southern Company with the McDonough demonstration. And I think it's important to note that at the time, that was the largest advanced class gas turbine demonstration in the world. Mm-hmm. So that wasn't just in the US, that was worldwide. And so some of the key benefits that we saw, emission levels were maintained. So NOx emissions, CO emissions that the rest of the community and the public are concerned about, we were able to look at that and show with actual data and be referenceable about how we can stay within our EPA limits. One of the other benefits that was shown was the fact that we could turn down to lower loads than what normally could be achieved. And so data points that are referenceable, that are reviewed, and being able to have trustworthy data like that out into the industry is very important right now as we look to this very disruptive change as we're thinking about trying to decarbonize our energy sector.
One of the things I think demonstrations also really highlight is how recursive our learning and understanding of all of this is. And as much as we want to say, a turbine is a turbine is a turbine, there's so much that goes into these machines and their relationship with the plant and the employees that are working there and the literal environment, right, and the things that they have to withstand. Doing a demonstration, and like you're saying, we now have this. These are the data points. We can go back, we can tweak, we can move forward.
Yeah, and I think also when we think about the plant engagement, there's a key aspect there on safety. Mm-hmm. So there's so many concerns over hydrogen as far as safety goes. And being able to do these demonstrations and being able to work together with the site personnel and come up with proper safety procedures and protocols so that we can do these sorts of things on a normal basis, and seeing the industry being able to embrace that is really important right now. And so McDonough was a great example of using almost 21% hydrogen by volume and using that blend in a safe, reliable way while still providing electricity to the greater Atlanta area.
Right. And so you used a term earlier, you said we're on the cusp of a paradigm shift here. And so I want to go back to that for a moment, because I think that really encapsulates where we're at. Yeah. Another way to think about it is that we're kind of on the precipice of like the second industrial revolution. We've got an infrastructure problem, right? Yep. But in a larger sense too, we've got our relationship with power is changing, the way we use it, why we use it. And that's even before the past 15 months with the advent of data centers and, them entering the stage. But also after the pandemic, our work hours are different, right? Like the workforce has changed. And so all of these are coming together, and it's kind of up to the energy sector to lead the way for baseload power, because otherwise none of this other stuff is possible.
I think that's a great point to bring up as far as liking this to an industrial revolution. One of the key aspects, if we look back in history, is the Industrial Revolution, for at least the U.S. and part of Europe, was nearly 80 years.
Yes.
Many of our goals, we have 20, 25, maybe 30 years at most to be able to capture these changes that need to happen. And so the other aspect is many parts of the world are going through their first industrial
Yes.
revolution as well. So when we think about trying to clean up the energy industry, there's a lot of challenges there because unlike the first industrial revolution where we had time
Yeah.
and there wasn't a race to a finish line, we have many finish lines that are already out there, whether they be 2030 goals, 2035, 2040, 2050. Those dates are coming up very quickly.
Those are great points. And yeah, you're totally right that we have the advantage of, we've already experienced an industrial revolution. So in that sense, it's a privilege to be where we're at. The other advantage, I think, too, of the first industrial revolution is that they had the clean slate.
Right.
And so a big part now of the energy landscape is retrofitting, future-proofing, right, correcting, and just trying to better the equipment and the infrastructure as we go along.
Well, and as a society, 99% reliability is not good enough.
Right.
we really want 99.999 and keep going. I mean, when you think about it, I have plenty of neighbors who will complain if the power even cuts off and cuts back on because they have to reset all of their clocks, for example. So as we look, we have a high standard that we've got to keep. And so as a society, we want to have reliable energy. But then when we think about, you mentioned data centers, and I think that's really important. That is a huge disruptive change.
Huge disruptive
And so
change.
when I look at load growths that are already happening, that
Yeah.
are becoming exponential, the projections are becoming even more exponential. I just read an article this morning where Ireland, for the first time, their data centers have a higher load than their residential. And so when we think about this makes a big challenge because the electric sector is going to take a majority of the decarbonization backbone because you think about transportation. Electric vehicles are a big topic. And then you have buildings that are switching from maybe some sort of fuel-based gas possibly facility to now they're going to be all electric. So there's so many other industries that are switching and needing those electrons. And so from the power industry, there's a lot of additional needs, and it makes the challenges even greater.
Which this segues actually nicely into one of the central paradoxes, I think, of the energy landscape right now is we're moving towards electrification. We know that is good. We know that decarbonization is a good thing. And yet, if we don't have a grid that can support everyone driving an EV, right, we're still on coal and natural gas to fuel our EVs. Right. So it's balancing all of those things and being realistic in our energy mix for whatever the end result is that we want. One of the other paradoxes I came across in one of your reports, which I thought was great, was, the honest assessment that potentially one of the better ways to decarbonize long-term is to increase reliance on natural gas. So can you walk me through that?
Optionality will be how we get to our decarbonization goals. And so what I mean by that is we can't just pick a winner. From the research standpoint, EPRI, we're looking at the broad landscape. So if we can look at carbon capture as a possible option, that is a solution that could get us to some of those goals. And so I think that is one of the things that we're seeing. But when we talk about why gas turbines, we see the buildup of renewables. So lots of solar, lots of wind. Hydro has its limitations as far as there has to be land features to be able to install hydro. So really your biggest renewables that you're seeing are the wind and the solar build-outs. Those are not dispatchable. We get electrons from those when we can. Yeah. So we need assets that can follow the load and respond when we need them. And gas turbines have really been able to fill that role. And so while, yes, right now they're on natural gas, looking at other fuels like hydrogen or ammonia is a great option for the future that we're continuing to examine. But again, there has to be a supply aspect to that. But the other possibility and what makes gas turbines even more flexible is the potential for doing carbon capture.
So in your day-to-day conversations that you're having with people across the energy transition, what are some things that you wish people knew or wish people would ask you or understood about the energy landscape as we're seeing it today?
Yeah, so that's a great question and thought there, because gas turbines, typically we're used to them burning hydrocarbon fuels. And so we feel pretty comfortable, with our knowledge and understanding of natural gas, of some of the liquid fuels that gas turbines run off of. But when we start to talk about changing to hydrogen or ammonia, these are completely different fuels as far as they're carbon free. Now that makes a difference on many aspects, and so I'll touch on a couple. One, the blanket statement that I hear is hydrogen burns hotter than natural gas. Now, while that is true for the adiabatic flame temperature of hydrogen at stoichiometric is higher than natural gas. The aspect that we look at is we're using dry low NOx technology. And so as we look to use dry low NOx technology, the reason it's dry low NOx for natural gas is we can control the reaction temperature. You can still do the same thing on hydrogen, and I know Mitsubishi and others are working to get to 100% dry low NOx capabilities, and each year we're seeing all of the numbers go higher and higher for percent capabilities. What that means is that I can still burn that fuel at the same expected temperature, and the temperature is the big driver for NOx creation. And so when you start to make those connections of burning hotter and higher NOx, well, that's actually something we've been able to show with demonstrations and the data there, and EPRI has several reports on it looking at NOx emissions can be the same or lower on hydrogen-containing fuels than natural gas. And so that is one fallacy that I think is out there. Now, is that true for some of the older diffusion systems? Yes. That's the reason why those older systems had higher NOx for natural gas, because without water injection, you could not control the firing temperature. Now, we do have other studies that EPRI has put out showing that you can actually increase water injection and still maintain NOx as well. So the blanket statement that hydrogen burns hotter, while there's truth to it, you have to qualify what kind of system that you're dealing with. And then the other aspect is back to the NOx aspect. I hear people a lot of times say, well, if I switch to hydrogen, I'm going to make higher NOx. Well, again, that's simply not true. That is one of the design aspects that all the OEMs are looking at, making a DLN system that is still the same NOx output or better than before. Maintaining that is a key parameter in the new designs that we're seeing. So then that leads to one other caveat. I mentioned no longer having a hydrocarbon fuel, but a carbon-free. So now that we're carbon-free, there's some differences in the way we look at the data coming out of the exhaust. So that emissions typically is a volumetric measurement that is corrected. So it typically removes water, and it typically corrects to a certain oxygen percentage. Why does that happen? Well, it's simply so that you don't add extra air into the system and dilute your NOx. It also means that you're not adding extra moisture to help dilute it as well. So it's trying to make sure that it's a fair comparison when you're taking these measurements. But now that we've removed carbon, you're taking that CO2, or what used to be CO2, and now you're primarily making water or extra water, and you also have extra oxygen left over. So the two of those together with the correction factors that you see with making it dry and going to either 15% or 16% O2, depending upon where you're at in the world, those two factors together can actually make the volumetric measurement look up to 40% higher. And so even though you're not actually creating more NOx, the measurement can make it look like it's higher. And so EPRI and Georgia Tech and a few others have gotten together, and we've written several journal articles and other white papers to try to explain this and help folks understand what the difference is. So again, we go back to when we look at data from examples like McDonough, where we took almost 21% hydrogen and blended it into the natural gas. We used the old standard for dry 15% O2 measurements. So when we're showing numbers on those corrected volumetric levels lower than what they were on natural gas, it actually means we were creating even less NOx because the actual mass was lower. So when we think about other misconceptions that are out there, one of the things that I do hear a lot is that when we move to a hydrogen fuel, for example, that it's going to affect my power output for my gas turbine. And part of that is associated with the heating value. So people look at the heating value from a volumetric standpoint and say, oh, it's so much lower. But really the gas turbine cares about the heating value on a mass basis, which is much higher. So there is a potential to see the same power output and maybe even higher if we keep the same firing temperature for a gas turbine. And so even with our demonstration at McDonough, we were able to see a slight increase in power output and a slight improvement on heat rate. So simply going to hydrogen does not mean that I'm going to have to produce less power or have to take a derate for my gas turbine, because there are beneficial aspects of the fuel. Now with that, on the volumetric side, that does mean that you're going to have to make some changes to your fuel valving and your piping and stuff for the delivery aspect. But from the gas turbine standpoint, there's actually benefits that we can see. But the other aspect that I hear a lot is, can we do this safely? And there's a lot of concerns over safety. And while, yes, there's examples of hydrogen in decades past being unsafe, every fuel can be unsafe.
Yes.
And so these demonstrations are allowing us to utilize codes and standards so that we can make sure that everything from hydrogen piping to seals and valves to hydrogen measurements, as far as looking at explosion limits and ensuring that we have no leaks in containment areas. All of these things come together so that we can put together procedures for sites that they can do this in a safe, reliable manner. And so safety is a huge concern.
Of course.
But it's a huge concern whether we're burning natural gas, whether even in your cars burning gasoline, because gasoline is a very explosive fuel as well. So the main thing is, it is a paradigm shift in the way we look at safety, because there's maybe new features, different things that we have to consider. But again, following codes and standards like ASME right now has the B3112 for hydrogen piping. Those aspects are there to keep us safe, and we ensure that our enclosures are rated to the proper classifications and other aspects. Again, keeping hydrogen in a safe and controlled manner. It has been done through these demonstrations, and as long as we continue to follow the safety procedures, we can continue to expect it to be done in a safe manner.
That goes back to your earlier point of, we cannot preemptively determine the winners and losers and make the data fit that, right? We have to have these good ideas, go for them, have the courage to go for them, do it safely, and see what the data tells us and how we can move forward best.
In fact, we kind of touched on this earlier with the Industrial Revolution. I would almost liken us to the space race. You know, we have a decade to get to the moon. Well, while we're not competing with other countries, we're actually all working together.
Sure.
And so, but the challenge is we have deadlines coming up quickly, and we're racing to get there. And so if the industry looks at only funding an option, the challenge with that is what if that option does not get us there? And so as we look at the space race for the U.S. Back in the day, they were actually looking at multiple rocket motors and different configurations for getting the U.S. to the moon. And so when we think about it, having optionality is what's going to help us. This is a challenge. It's going to take many different sectors within the energy realm working together. And this is kind of unprecedented to think that the transportation sector, working with the electric sector, working with
agriculture.
Exactly. Everybody's going to be affected by this. And so we have to work together to ensure that we build out the energy industry the way it needs to look. You know, one of the big questions, again, how do we get the hydrogen, for example? Where is it coming from? Well, as the United States and the rest of the world looks at building out a hydrogen industry, we need to see that there's actually outputs for hydrogen, whether it be for cars, whether it be for residential, whether it be for the power industry. And so we need to all work together so that we have the proper infrastructure in place. And so it's great to see, you know, the DOE hydrogen hubs, for example, being a play. And I know Mitsubishi has a great example with the Delta Utah project. So there's a lot of great activities going on, not only in the U.S., but around the world. But working together is going to be how we accomplish our goals.
Absolutely. And I think for for your general American citizen, they turn their lights on and off. They're not worried about, does this come from a good energy source, right? And all of the things behind that. And part of the difficulty, I think, in our position in trying to educate the general public on topics like hydrogen is that optionality portion. Because the answer to so many questions about hydrogen is, well, it depends.
Right.
And so you have to start there. And that's not an alluring thing, right? But really embracing that and saying, like, look, what works over at the Pacific Northwest hub works for them. And they've got a different offtake strategy and they've got a different system than what ACE's Delta is.
That's right.
They are both hydrogen hubs, but it's rectangles and squares, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up as well, because when we think about water, for example, to make hydrogen, well, if I start to look at a desert area like Arizona, they would much rather have their water for drinking. And so, but then when you think about in the Southeast where water is a little more plentiful, maybe that's a better option here. You look at certain areas where maybe power plants are more centrally located. Having some sort of hydrogen production for those facilities may make sense because you have less infrastructure that you have to put in to distribute. So everybody's going to have a different solution as we're working together, and it's why it's so important to have these options.
Because the big part of that too is who's got the storage.
That's right.
Right? Who's got it? Who do we have to build it for?
Yep.
And for things like carbon capture, it's the same type of thing. You can do this now. We can put carbon capture on the back end, but just, keep it in mind, right? Yep. All of these options that you have.
Well, and like I said, it's great with EPRI and our Low Carbon Resources Initiative. In fact, Mitsubishi is a member of the Low Carbon Resources Initiative. And so it's great to have the engagement from so many different stakeholders, from gas turbine OEMs to gas suppliers to power producers, you name it. The involvement is broad there, and it's also worldwide. And so it's been a good kickstart to see a lot of these projects get the research that needs to happen, because there's a lot of fundamental aspects that we're changing, and we need that fundamental research all the way to more applied and demonstration type activities.
Absolutely. So my last question for you would be, how do you see the future of hydrogen? Where do you see us sitting in 10 years if we're having this conversation again?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so if I look into my crystal ball,
dust it off.
Exactly. I have my hopes and my desires, of course, for hydrogen and gas turbines. But one of the key aspects that we're starting to see is potentially hydrogen being maybe more for starting out with some of the peaker plants, so that the gas volume is less for those. And maybe that's the right start. When we think about some of the bigger combined cycle gas turbines, carbon capture is probably going to be a better option there, as they're more base loaded. And so, but as the industry continues to evolve and change, what do we see? It's going to be interesting. I mean, we barely mentioned ammonia, but ammonia is another big topic.
Another player.
I know that Asia is very much interested in ammonia because now we start to think about hydrogen and ammonia as energy carriers, not just fuels. So as we mentioned earlier, lots of renewable build out. Well, using that extra renewable energy to make a fuel as an energy storage aspect is one of the options that we're talking about. And so can we start to see this with peaker units? The other thing is thinking about renewable liquid fuels. So is that another option? Because we still need liquid backup at many of these sites, because black start capabilities are a key aspect with many gas turbines that are installed today. And we'll still need that as we move forward into the future. But I do see that we've got a lot of great effort moving hydrogen forward. We've got lots of great examples of 50 to 60% hydrogen blend capability for large gas turbines. Some of the smaller gas turbines have shown even higher, and all of this for dry low NOx. But I've been fortunate enough to visit the T-Point facility in Japan and seeing a lot of the great work there that Mitsubishi has. And so I know that Mitsubishi and others are pushing towards that 100%. And again, part of the global collaboration is different areas have different targets. So maybe one thing we didn't quite mention on is the cost of fuel. While natural gas here in the U.S. is really cheap, it's not cheap in Europe, and it's definitely not cheap in Asia. And so hydrogen becomes a much more viable fuel in some of these different regions at a lower cost production. And so one of the things that I'm eager to see is how we can learn and work together with some of our partners along with Mitsubishi and seeing how everything works in Asia, as they may be able to transition to utilizing hydrogen or ammonia at an earlier state, and then what can the U.S. and the rest of the world learn from a lot of the activities going on there.
Right, that's a great point. That brings us back to the top of the conversation, which is truly everyone is at a different point of energy transition.
That's right.
And understanding that, accepting that for what it is, and using that to move forward is kind of where we're at.
Yep.
And have to be.
Yep. Well, global collaboration, working together is how we're going to get there, and keeping those options open. And hydrogen being one of those viable options that we're seeing to start to decarbonize the industry is going to be key.
All right, Bobby, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I think those are some great insights on the energy transition generally, but hydrogen specifically, and the research's role in propelling us and accelerating us more towards net zero. So thank you so much for your time.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Lightbulb Moments, brought to you by Mitsubishi Power. I will include Bobby's LinkedIn. You can follow him on socials, and the EPRI website in our show notes. They've got a library of wonderful information ranging from, like he said, white papers and research studies to just thought leadership and what the energy transition looks like for us in the coming years. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.